There are places on this earth where winter is not a season. It is a fact. A hard, undeniable fact that shapes everything. Where people live, how they build, what they eat, and how they sleep. In the high plains of North America and the cold plateau basins of the Northwest, winter arrives with a clarity that leaves no room for error. The temperature falls, the wind rises, and the world becomes a place where survival is measured not in weeks, but in the warmth you can hold through a single night. This is a story about warmth, not the kind that comes from burning more wood or wearing thicker clothes, but the kind that comes from understanding something fundamental about the earth itself. It is a story about people who looked at the frozen ground beneath their feet and saw not an obstacle, but an answer. They built homes that disappeared into the landscape, homes that let the planet itself do the work of keeping them alive. And in those homes, through the coldest months, they slept in safety. We're going to move slowly through this story. We will look at the problem first, the cold and the wind, and what they do to the human body. Then we will look at the principle that solved it. And finally, we will see how two different peoples, in two different landscapes, shaped that principle into two distinct forms of shelter. One along the Missouri River in the Dakotas, one in the high basins of the Plateau country to the west, both underground, both warm. Let the world outside grow quiet, let the wind settle, and let us begin. Autumn in the high plains is brief. The grasses turn gold, the cottonwoods along the rivers go yellow, and the air takes on a particular smell, dry, sharp, faintly metallic. The herds begin to move, the birds gather in restless flocks, and the people begin to prepare. The first cold arrives in September, sometimes earlier. It comes in the morning, a chill that burns the lungs, a frost that silvers the grass. By October, the nights are hard and still. By November, the true cold has settled in. This is not the cold of a coastal winter or a temperate valley. This is the cold of the interior, the cold of elevation and distance from any moderating ocean. It is a cold that can reach 40 degrees below zero and stay there for days, 40 below zero Fahrenheit. A temperature so low that the air itself feels solid, brittle, like something that might crack if you moved through it too quickly. But temperature alone does not tell the full story. The real threat, the thing that makes this cold lethal, is the wind. The high plains are open. From the foothills of the Rockies to the river valleys of the Dakotas, there is nothing to stop the wind, no forest to break it up, no mountains to deflect it. The wind gathers speed across hundreds of miles of flat or gently rolling land, and by the time it reaches a person standing in the open, it is moving fast, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, sometimes more. Wind does not just make cold air feel colder, it physically strips heat away. Human skin, human clothing, the walls of a shelter, all of these have a thin boundary layer of warmer air clinging to them. Wind removes that layer. It pulls heat directly off the surface and carries it away. This is wind chill, and it is not a sensation. It is a physical process of heat transfer. At 40 below zero with a strong wind, exposed skin can freeze in less than 5 minutes. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, these freeze first. The body pulls blood away from the extremities, trying to protect the core. Frostbite begins as numbness, then pain, then nothing. The tissue dies. A person caught outside in these conditions without shelter will die. Not might die, will die. The body cannot generate heat fast enough to replace what the wind is taking. Core temperature drops. Shivering becomes violent, then stops. Confusion sets in. The heart slows. Death follows. This was the environment. This was the reality. And in this reality, shelter was not a comfort. It was the line between life and death. An above-ground shelter in these conditions faces a specific and profound challenge. Consider a teepee, a cone of wooden poles covered in sewn bison hides. It is portable, practical, beautiful in its simplicity. For much of the year, across much of the plains, it is an excellent home. But in deep winter, at 40 below, with the wind howling, it struggles. The hides, even when doubled or layered, offer only modest insulation. They block the wind mostly. They keep out the snow, but they do not hold heat well. Heat from the fire inside rises naturally, driven by convection. It gathers at the top of the cone and escapes through the smoke hole. Cold air seeps in at ground level, through the door, through any gap in the hides. The fire must be kept burning constantly. Wood must be gathered constantly. And still, the space is uneven. Near the fire, it is warm, sometimes too warm. A few feet away near the walls, the air is cold. At ground level, drafts move across the floor, and then there is the wind. The wind presses against the teepee walls. It finds the seams, the lacing, the edges. It pulls heat directly through the hides. Worse, it creates a pressure differential. Wind flowing over a curved surface creates low pressure on the lee side, and this low pressure actively pulls warm air out of the structure. The teepee is being ventilated whether you want it or not. Fuel becomes the limiting factor. A family might burn through an enormous amount of wood just to keep the interior livable. In a landscape where trees are sparse and snow is deep, gathering that wood is dangerous, exhausting work. Other above-ground structures face the same physics. A rectangular hut, a domed wickiup. They all lose heat to the wind. They all require constant fires. They all have cold floors and drafts. The snow too is a factor. On the plains and the plateau, the snow is not wet and heavy. It is dry, light, crystalline. A strong wind picks it up and drives it horizontally across the landscape. It piles into drifts 10, 15, 20 feet deep. It buries landmarks. It makes travel nearly impossible. A person caught in a ground blizzard can lose all sense of direction within seconds. This snow is also sharp. The crystals are small and hard. Driven by wind, they sting exposed skin like sand. They infiltrate clothing. They find their way into shelters through the smallest gaps. This was the problem. The cold was predictable. The wind was constant. Above-ground shelters, no matter how well built, could not fully protect against the combination of the two. Something else was needed. A different principle. A different relationship with the landscape. The solution required understanding something that is not immediately obvious. The earth itself is not as cold as the air. Walk across a frozen plain in January. The surface is hard. The snow is powder. The air burns your lungs. Everything feels lifeless, inert. But dig down. Not far. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4. The soil changes. It is no longer frozen solid. It is cold, yes, but not 40 below. Not even close to 40 below. At a depth of just a few feet, the ground temperature stabilizes. It hovers near the freezing point of water, 32 degrees Fahrenheit or just above. This is geothermal energy, though the people who built the earth lodges did not call it that. It is the heat of the planet itself, conducted slowly upward from the molten core. The upper crust of the earth acts as a massive thermal reservoir. It absorbs heat from the sun during the warm months and holds it. It releases that heat slowly, over time, moderating the temperature of the shallow subsurface. There is a boundary called the frost line. Above this line, the ground freezes in winter. Below this line, it does not. The depth of the frost line depends on latitude, elevation, and local climate. But on the northern plains and plateau, it is typically between 3 and 5 feet deep. This means that if you place the floor of your home below the frost line, the ground beneath your feet is not a frozen slab pulling heat away from your body. It is a stable surface, radiating a faint but constant warmth. Not enough to heat a room on its own, but enough to mean that you are not fighting the ground itself. The air temperature outside might be 40 below. The surface of the ground might be frozen solid. But 6 feet down, the earth is holding steady at just above freezing. This is a difference of 70 degrees. 70 degrees of thermal protection provided by the earth itself for free, with no fuel required. This was the insight. This was the principle. The earth properly used is not a foundation on which to build. It is a blanket, a shelter, a source of warmth in its own right. To survive the winter, you do not need to fight the cold. You need to remove yourself from it. You need to go down. The Missouri River cuts through the Dakotas in long looping curves. Its valley is a ribbon of green in a sea of grass, cottonwoods, willows, box elders clustering along the banks. In the bends of the river, where the floodplain is wide and the soil is rich, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples built their villages. These were not camps. They were not temporary hunting grounds. They were permanent settlements, occupied year after year, generation after generation. The people who lived here were farmers as well as hunters. They grew corn, beans, and squash in the river-bottom fields. They stored the harvest in underground caches. They hunted bison on the plains when the herds came near, and when winter arrived they retreated into their lodges and lived on what they had gathered and preserved. The villages were large. Some held 50 lodges, some held 100. A single village might house 500 people, 1,000, sometimes more. The lodges were arranged in rough circles or arcs, with open plazas in the centre. Around the perimeter, palisades of wooden posts were sometimes erected for defence. Raised platforms inside the palisade allowed sentries to watch the plains for approaching enemies or herds. But the defining feature of these villages, the thing that made them unmistakable from a distance, was the lodges themselves. They were enormous, low, rounded structures, covered in earth. From a distance they looked like natural hills, like grass-covered mounds that had always been part of the landscape. Smoke rose from the centre of each mound, betraying the life inside. Each lodge was 40 to 60 feet in diameter. Some were larger. The largest could house 30 or 40 people, several related families sharing a single structure. Inside, the space was divided into sections by low partitions, by hanging hides, by the arrangement of sleeping platforms. But the fire was communal. The smoke hole was shared. The warmth was shared. These lodges were built to last. A well-maintained earth lodge could stand for 10 years, 15, sometimes longer. They were not torn down and rebuilt each year. They were repaired, patched, tended. They were homes in the full sense of the word, and they were built according to a principle that had been refined over centuries, the principle of going underground, of letting the earth itself do the work of holding the warmth. The work began in late summer or early autumn, when the weather was still warm and the ground was soft enough to dig. The first step was to mark the circle. A central stake was driven into the ground, and a rope or thong was tied to it. A person walked around the stake, keeping the rope taut, scratching a line in the earth with a pointed stick. The circle had to be precise, 40 feet across, 50, 60, whatever the size. The circle was the foundation of everything that followed. Next came the excavation. The floor of the lodge had to be below the surface, not far, 2 feet, 3 feet, sometimes 4. The goal was to drop the living space down out of the path of the wind and closer to the stable temperature of the earth. This was heavy work. The soil was dense prairie dirt thick with roots. Teams of workers, men, women, older children, used digging sticks, stone hoes, wooden shovels. The dirt was piled around the perimeter of the circle. It would be used later. The floor was levelled, smoothed, packed down hard. Once the pit was dug, the frame began. The heart of the lodge was 4 central posts. These were not small poles. They were massive cottonwood or willow logs, each a foot or more in diameter, carefully selected for straightness and strength. They were placed in a square at the centre of the circle, sunk deep into the ground, 3 feet, 4 feet down, set in holes lined with stones to keep them from shifting. These 4 pillars held symbolic weight. In Mandan tradition, they were said to represent the 4 directions, the 4 winds, the pillars that held up the sky. They were sometimes carved or painted. They were treated with respect. On top of these 4 pillars, heavy crossbeams were laid, forming a square frame at the centre of the lodge. This square was the skeleton of the roof, the structural core that would bear the weight of everything to come. Around the perimeter of the pit, another ring of posts was set, shorter than the central 4 but still substantial. These outer posts formed a circle, and horizontal beams were laid connecting them, creating a ring beam that ran all the way around the lodge. From this outer ring, rafters were laid inward, sloping upward to rest on the central square frame. The rafters were placed close together, each one a peeled log or a strong branch, overlapping at the centre to create a slightly domed roof structure. The centre was left open, a square hole directly above the fire pit. The frame, when complete, was a sturdy interlocking skeleton of wood. It was designed to hold weight, a great deal of weight. The skeleton alone would not keep out the wind. The skeleton alone would not hold the warmth. What came next was the skin, the insulation, the blanket that turned a wooden frame into a home. The first layer was willow branches. Thin, flexible willow shoots were woven together into large mats, each mat several feet across. These mats were laid over the rafters, overlapping, tied down with cordage made from plant fibre or sinew. The willow layer created a continuous semi-rigid surface. It kept the next layers from falling through the gaps between the rafters. On top of the willow, a layer of prairie grass was laid. Not loose grass, but grass bundled into tight sheaves, arranged like thatch. The bundles were placed in overlapping rows starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. The grass shed water, it trapped air. It began the process of insulation. Then came the earth. The soil that had been excavated from the floor was now put to use. It was mixed with clay, if clay was available, to make it more cohesive. It was carried up onto the roof in baskets and spread in a thick, even layer over the grass. More soil was added, and more. The final layer of earth and sod was often a foot thick, sometimes more. This was not loose dirt. It was packed down, tamped, smoothed. Women, who were often the masters of this stage of construction, would walk on the roof, packing it with their feet, tending the surface, ensuring there were no thin spots. As the sod settled and the grass roots knit together, the roof became a solid, nearly waterproof shell. From the outside, the finished lodge looked like a low, round hill. The earth covering was thick enough that grass and wildflowers would grow on it. In summer, the roof might be green with new growth. In winter, it was white with snow. The entrance was the final critical element. It was not a simple door in the wall. It was a long covered passageway, extending out from the main structure like a tunnel. This passageway was also dug into the ground, roofed over, and covered with earth. It was 8 feet long, 10 feet, sometimes more. The purpose of this long entrance was to create an airlock. Cold wind could not blow directly into the lodge. A person entering would walk down the passage, turn a corner or pass through a baffle, and only then step into the main interior. Warm air from the lodge did not rush out. Cold air from outside did not rush in. The passage slowed everything down, buffered the temperature change. At the inner end of the passage, a hide curtain could be hung for additional insulation. On the coldest nights, 2 curtains might be used, with a small space between them. The construction was complete. The lodge was ready. To enter an earth lodge on a winter day was to move from one world into another. Outside, the wind. The pale, flat light of a winter sun low on the horizon. The cold pressing in from all sides. Inside, stillness. Warmth. Dim, amber light. You would walk across the snow-covered roof, approach the entrance of the passageway and descend. The passage sloped gently downward, and the walls closed in around you. The wind sound faded. Your breath, which had been visible in sharp plumes outside, began to soften. At the end of the passage, you pushed aside the hide curtain and stepped into the lodge. The first impression was the space. The lodge was vast, 40 feet across, 50, the domed roof rising high enough to stand comfortably in the center. But the light was low. The only sources were the central fire and the smoke hole above it. The fire was a bed of glowing coals and small flames in a shallow clay-lined pit. The smoke hole was a square opening directly above, framing a patch of pale winter sky. The air was still, completely still. There was no draft, no movement. The temperature was warm, not hot, but comfortably warm. Warm enough to sit without heavy robes, warm enough to sleep. The smoke from the fire rose in a steady vertical column. It drifted upward through the smoke hole and disappeared. The hole was small, 3 feet across, perhaps 4, and the column of hot air rising from the fire created a natural draft. Cold air could not sink down through that rising column. The smoke hole vented the fire perfectly, and the heat stayed inside. This was not an accident. The size of the smoke hole, the height of the roof, the placement of the fire, all of these had been calibrated over generations. Too large a hole and heat would escape. Too small and smoke would fill the lodge. The balance was precise, and it worked. Around the perimeter of the lodge, raised platforms had been built. These were sleeping and sitting areas, each one assigned to a family or a section of the extended family. The platforms were made of wooden planks or poles laid across supports, raised a foot or two off the ground. They were covered with woven mats, then with thick bison robes and furs. Between the platforms, low partitions of hide or woven reed created a sense of privacy, dividing the vast circle into smaller, more intimate alcoves. Each family had its own space, but the fire, the warmth, the smoke hole, these were shared. The floor itself was the packed earth, smooth and clean. In the center, Around the fire, the floor was often covered with mats or hides where people could sit to work or talk. Around the edges, the floor was bare. Set into the floor, scattered around the lodge, were storage pits. These were bell-shaped holes, narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, dug deep into the earth. Some were 3 feet deep, some 5. They were lined with grass or bark to keep the contents dry. In these pits, the harvest was stored. Dried corn still on the cob, braided and bundled. Dried squash, dried meat, bags of beans. The mouth of each pit was covered with a wooden lid or a flat stone, then hidden under a mat. The cool, stable temperature of the earth kept the food preserved. It did not freeze. It did not rot. It simply waited. Once the deep cold settled in, life in the village changed its rhythm. The work of summer and autumn, planting, tending the fields, harvesting, hunting, was done. The food was stored. The lodges were prepared. Winter was a season of containment, a season of living on what had already been gathered. People spent most of their time inside the lodges, not because they were trapped, but because there was no reason to go out into the cold unless necessary. The lodges were comfortable, they were warm, and they held everything needed for daily life. The days were short. The sun rose late and set early, and even at midday the light was pale and weak. Inside the lodge, time was marked not by the sun, but by the fire and the tasks at hand. Mornings began slowly, with a particular quality of stillness. The fire, banked the night before, had burned down to a bed of deep red coals buried in white ash. The first person to wake, often one of the elder women, though the pattern varied by family, would rise from their sleeping platform, wrapped in a bison robe against the cool morning air. The lodge was not cold, but it was cooler than it had been the evening before, and the body felt the difference. She would move quietly to the fire pit, careful not to disturb the others still sleeping. Kneeling beside the coals, she would use a stick to brush away some of the ash, exposing the glowing embers beneath. These coals, if properly banked, could hold heat through an entire night. 8 hours, 10 hours, sometimes more. Small pieces of dry kindling were placed on the exposed coals. Bark, shredded fine, dried grass, small twigs. She would lean close and blow gently, steadily, feeding oxygen to the embers. The kindling would begin to smoke, then catch. Small flames would appear, yellow and tentative at first, then growing stronger. Larger pieces of wood were added. Split cottonwood, willow, whatever had been gathered and dried. The fire came back to life. The flames grew. The smoke rose in its steady column toward the hole above. As the fire built, the lodge began to warm. The change was gradual, gentle. The earth walls, which had been radiating stored heat all night, now began to absorb new heat from the growing flames. The air temperature rose slowly. Other members of the household began to stir. Children emerged from beneath heavy robes, blinking in the firelight. Men sat up on their platforms, stretching, coughing quietly. The lodge began to fill with the small sounds of waking. Low voices, the rustle of furs, footsteps on the packed earth floor. People moved to the fire to warm themselves. They stood close, hands extended, turning slowly to warm all sides of their bodies. Breath was still visible in the cooler air near the walls, but near the fire the air was already comfortable. The waking process was unhurried. There was no alarm, no schedule to keep. The body woke when it woke. The day began when it began. Time moved differently in winter, measured not in hours but in the completion of tasks, in the movement of light through the smoke hole, in the feeling of hunger that signaled the need for another meal. One of the first tasks each morning was ensuring there was water for the day. In the deep cold, water management became a daily consideration. The Missouri River, frozen solid by December, could no longer provide flowing water. Snow was the primary source. Clean snow was gathered from outside, not the surface layer, which might be contaminated by wind-blown debris, but the clean layer beneath. The snow was brought inside in leather bags or baskets and placed near the fire. As it melted, it was poured into large clay pots or leather containers for storage. Some lodges maintained a water pot near the fire at all times. This pot was kept full, and the water in it was always slightly warm from proximity to the flames. This warm water was used for cooking, for washing hands and faces, for preparing medicines or teas from dried herbs. The process of melting snow was slow. Snow is mostly air, and a large basket of snow might yield only a small amount of water. Several trips might be required to gather enough for the day's needs. On the coldest days, when venturing outside was particularly unpleasant, people might conserve water carefully, using it sparingly, knowing that the next resupply would require someone to brave the wind and cold. The water itself tasted different in winter. Meltwater from snow has a clean, slightly flat taste, lacking the mineral notes of river water, but it was pure and safe, and it served its purpose. As the household fully woke, the work of preparing food began. The first priority was always the morning meal. Breakfast was simple but necessary. Fuel for the body in the cold season. Corn was the foundation. The dried corn, stored in the underground pits, was brought out. The kernels were still on the cob, protected by their husks. A woman would sit near the fire with several ears of corn, stripping the dried kernels off with her hands, or with a tool made from a piece of deer antler carved into a scraper. The sound of this stripping was distinctive, a dry, rattling sound as the hard kernels fell into a basket or bowl. It was one of the characteristic sounds of winter mornings in the lodge. The kernels were hard, almost like small stones. They could not be eaten in this state. They had to be ground. The grinding was done with stone tools, a flat grinding stone called a metate, and a smaller hand stone called a mano. The metate was a heavy piece of sandstone or basalt, shaped with a shallow depression in its surface from years of use. The mano was a smooth, rounded stone that fit comfortably in both hands, also worn smooth by repeated use. A woman would kneel or sit before the metate, pour a handful of corn kernels into the depression, and begin to grind. The mano was pushed forward with both hands, the weight of the body leaning into the motion, crushing and grinding the kernels against the rough surface of the metate. The motion was rhythmic, steady, almost meditative. Push forward, lift back, push forward again. The kernels broke down slowly. First they cracked into large pieces with a sharp sound. Then the pieces were ground smaller, becoming a coarse meal. More grinding and the meal became finer. The texture depended on the patience of the grinder and the intended use. Coarse for some dishes, fine for others. This took time. Grinding enough corn for a single meal for a family of 5 or 6 could take half an hour or more. It was repetitive work, requiring sustained effort. The arms and shoulders bore the strain. The knees, pressed against the hard floor, grew sore. But it was necessary work, and it was shared. Often 2 or 3 women would be grinding simultaneously, their rhythms overlapping, the sounds creating a texture of industry. The cornmeal, once ground to the desired consistency, was mixed with water in a clay pot. The consistency depended on what was being made. For a thin porridge, the most common breakfast, more water was added, creating a mixture that was almost liquid. For cakes or bread, less water, creating a thick dough that could be shaped. The porridge was cooked directly over the fire. The clay pot was set on stones arranged around the edge of the fire pit, positioned carefully so the flames licked the sides of the pot but did not touch it directly in a way that might crack the clay. The mixture was stirred occasionally with a wooden paddle to keep it from burning on the bottom. As it cooked, it thickened, the water being absorbed by the cornmeal, taking on a smooth, creamy texture. The smell of cooking corn filled the lodge. It was a sweet, earthy smell, slightly nutty, warm and comforting. It was the smell of breakfast, the smell of the beginning of the day. While the porridge cooked, other foods were prepared. Dried meat was often added to the morning meal. Strips of bison jerky, preserved from the autumn hunt, were brought out from storage. The meat was dark, almost black, hard and brittle. It had been dried in the sun and wind until almost all moisture was gone, then packed away in leather bags. The meat was hard enough that it was difficult to chew in its dried state. Some pieces were added directly to the porridge, where they would soften as they cooked, releasing their flavour and fat into the mixture. Other pieces were held near the fire, warming and softening slightly, making them easier to tear and chew. Some families preferred to roast strips of meat directly over the flames. A strip would be speared on a sharpened stick and held just above the coals. As the meat warmed, the fat within it would begin to render, dripping and sizzling into the fire, producing small flares of flame and a rich, savoury smell. The meat would char slightly on the surface, adding a smoky flavour. Dried squash, when available, was another common addition. The squash had been cut into rings or strips and dried in the sun months before. Now it was as hard as the corn, shriveled and light. The pieces were added to the porridge, where they would reconstitute, softening and swelling as they absorbed water. The The squash added sweetness and a different texture to the meal. Herbs and flavouring were added sparingly but thoughtfully. Dried sage, wild onion, prairie turnip. These were stored in small leather pouches, carefully preserved. A pinch of dried sage added to the porridge gave it an earthy, slightly pungent flavour. Wild onion, crumbled fine, added a sharp note. These flavours were subtle, never overwhelming, but they made the difference between bland subsistence and food that was genuinely satisfying. The taste of winter food was different from the fresh abundance of summer. Everything was dried, preserved, reconstituted. The textures were softer, the flavours more concentrated. But it was nourishing. A bowl of corn porridge with dried meat and squash provided substantial energy. Carbohydrates from the corn, protein and fat from the meat, vitamins from the squash. Meals were eaten in a relaxed manner. There were no individual plates or bowls for each person in the modern sense. Food was served in shared clay vessels or in baskets, and people ate using their fingers or with simple wooden spoons. Children ate alongside adults, learning through observation the proper way to eat, the proper amount to take, the importance of not being wasteful. After the morning meal, the clay pots and baskets were cleaned. They were scraped out with wooden paddles to remove any stuck food, then rinsed with a small amount of water. The remaining residue was often fed to the dogs that lived in and around the village, or simply discarded outside. Nothing was wasted if it could be used. After the morning meal, the serious work of the day began. Winter was the season for tasks that required time, patience, and sustained effort. There was no planting to do, no weeding, no immediate harvest to bring in. The stored food was ample. The days were short and the weather was prohibitive for outdoor work. This was the time for handwork, for the creation and maintenance of all the tools and materials that would be needed in the coming year. For women, hide processing was one of the most important and time-consuming winter tasks. The bison hunt in late autumn had provided the raw material. Each animal yielded a massive hide, thick, heavy, covered in dense fur. These hides, when fresh, had been roughly cleaned and dried, rolled up and stored. Now, in the long winter days, they would be transformed into soft, pliable leather. The process was complex and physically demanding. A hide would be brought out from storage, unrolled, and laid out on the floor of the lodge, fur side down. Even dried, the hide was stiff, almost like a thick piece of cardboard. The inner surface, the flesh side, was rough and uneven. The first step was to remove any remaining bits of flesh, fat, or membrane that had been missed during the initial cleaning. This was done with a scraper, a tool made from a large bone, often a bison leg bone, shaped and sharpened into a wide curved blade. The scraper had a handle, allowing the user to grip it firmly and apply pressure. The woman would kneel beside the hide, position the scraper at one edge, and push it firmly across the surface. The motion required strength, leaning body weight into the tool, pushing it across the hide, shaving away material. The scraper made a rhythmic grating sound as it moved, a steady scrape, scrape, scrape that filled the lodge. This was hard work. The arms and shoulders bore the effort. The back strained from the bent position. It could take an hour or more to scrape a single large hide clean. The woman would work steadily, stopping occasionally to rest, to warm her hands by the fire, to drink water. Other women in the lodge might be doing the same work, and they would talk quietly as they worked, sharing the labour and the companionship. Once the hide was scraped clean, it was treated. The treatment was what transformed stiff rawhide into soft leather. Animal brains were the key ingredient. The brains had been saved from the butchering, carefully removed, wrapped, and stored. They were fatty and rich, and they contained natural enzymes and oils that broke down the protein structure of the hide. The brains were mixed with water in a clay pot and worked into a thick, creamy paste. This paste smelled strong, rich, fatty, slightly gamey, but not unpleasant. It was a familiar smell, associated with the work of making leather. The paste was applied to the hide. Using her hands, the woman would scoop up handfuls of the brain mixture and smear it over the entire surface of the hide, rubbing it in, coating every inch. The flesh side was treated most heavily, but the fur side was also worked, the paste massaging into the roots of the hair. Once the hide was thoroughly coated, it was rolled up and set aside. The brain mixture needed time to penetrate the hide to soak into the fibres. The hide would be left for several hours, sometimes overnight. When enough time had passed, the real work began, the work of softening. The hide had to be worked. It had to be stretched, pulled, flexed, twisted, subjected to constant repetitive motion that broke down the protein bonds and aligned the fibers in a way that made the hide soft and pliable. This could be done in several ways. Two people might work together, each holding opposite edges of the hide and pulling it back and forth between them in a rhythmic tug-of-war. The hide would be pulled taut, then relaxed, then pulled taut again, over and over. The motion was steady, almost hypnotic. Or a single person might use a stretching frame, a wooden frame with the hide laced to it tightly all around the edges. The frame held the hide taut, and the worker would use a smooth stick or bone tool to rub and press the hide, working it section by section, pushing and pulling to loosen the fibers. Another method was to work the hide over a vertical pole or beam. The hide would be pulled back and forth over the smooth surface, the friction and bending working the fibers. This was especially effective for smaller hides. No matter the method, the work took hours. The hide had to be worked constantly as it dried. If it was allowed to dry without this constant manipulation, it would stiffen again, and the brain treatment would have to be repeated. The women worked patiently, steadily. Their hands grew tired, their arms ached, but they persisted. Gradually, as the hide dried, it began to change. It became softer, more flexible. The stiffness left it, and it began to feel like leather, supple, smooth, workable. When the hide was fully softened, it still needed one more treatment: smoking. Smoking served multiple purposes. It gave the leather its characteristic tan color. It added a pleasant, lasting scent, and most importantly, it made the leather water-resistant. A smoked hide could get wet and still return to softness when it dried. An unsmoked hide would stiffen again when wet. The hide was formed into a kind of tent or bag suspended over a small fire. The fire was not allowed to flame. It was kept at a smolder, producing thick, cool smoke. Rotted wood, damp sage, or green willow were added to increase the smoke production. The smoke rose up into the hide, filling it, permeating the fibers. The hide was left over the smoke for an hour, sometimes longer, turned occasionally to ensure even coverage. When it was removed, it was the color of caramel, and it carried a deep, woody smell that would never fully leave it. The finished leather was beautiful and functional. It was soft enough to drape and fold. It was strong enough to last for years. It could be sewn into clothing, shirts, dresses, leggings. It could be made into moccasins. It could be used for bags, for ties, for 100 different purposes. A single hide from beginning to end might take 3 or 4 days of work. But the result was worth the effort. Leather was essential. It was clothing, shelter, tools, art. The winter months provided the time to create it. While the women worked hides, the men focused on tools. Winter was the season for this work. Tools that had been used hard during the active months, during the hunt, during the harvest, during the building and repairing, now needed attention. Blades had dulled, hafts had cracked or come loose, bindings had frayed, and new tools needed to be made to replace those that had been lost or broken beyond repair. The work was done near the fire, where the light was best and the warmth made the hands nimble. Arrows required constant attention. A hunter might use dozens of arrows in a single season, and each one needed to be perfect. A poorly made arrow would fly crooked, miss its target, perhaps even injure the hunter if it broke or split. Each arrow began as a straight shaft of wood. Finding and preparing arrow shafts was work done in the summer and fall, but the final finishing was winter work. The shafts were smoothed with abrading stones, checked for straightness, and corrected if necessary. Straightening an arrow shaft required heat and patience. The shaft was warmed near the fire, held in the flames until it was hot but not burning. Then, while it was hot and pliable, it was bent gently in the opposite direction of any curve or warp. The shaft was held in this position until it cooled, then checked again. If it was still not straight, the process was repeated. Once the shaft was straight and smooth, it was notched at one end to receive the bowstring. This notch had to be precise, deep enough to grip the string securely, but not so deep that it weakened the shaft. The stone point was then hafted to the other end. Stone points, made from flint, chert, or obsidian, were created through the process of knapping, and this too was winter work. A skilled napper could take a nodule of raw stone and, through careful, precise striking, reduce it to a thin, sharp, symmetrical point in a matter of hours. The napping was done by holding the stone in one hand, cushioned by a piece of leather to protect the palm, and striking it with another stone or with a piece of antler. Each strike removed a flake, and the flakes were carefully controlled in size and placement to shape the point. The sound of napping was sharp and distinctive. Crack, crack, crack. A percussion that carried through the lodge. The flakes that flew off were razor sharp and had to be gathered carefully, so no one would step on them or accidentally cut themselves. Once a point was made, it was hafted to the arrow shaft. A small slot was cut into the end of the shaft, and the base of the point was inserted into this slot. Then sinew, dried tendon from bison or deer, was used to bind the point tightly in place. The sinew was wrapped around the shaft and the base of the point. Pulled taut, wrapped again. When dry, sinew shrinks slightly, tightening the binding even further. Pine resin or hide glue was applied over the sinew binding to seal it and add strength. The glue was made by boiling pieces of hide and hooves until they broke down into a sticky, gelatinous substance. When warm, this glue was liquid and could be applied easily. As it cooled, it hardened, creating a strong bond. The finished arrow was then fletched, fitted with feathers to stabilize its flight. Turkey or hawk feathers were preferred. The feathers were split down the center, and 3 half feathers were attached to the shaft near the nock, evenly spaced around the circumference. These too were bound with sinew and glued in place. A good arrow was a precision instrument, the product of many hours of careful work. A hunter might spend the entire winter making and repairing arrows, building up a supply for the coming year. Bows too required maintenance. A bow was a hunter's most valuable possession, a tool that required years to master, and one that could mean the difference between a successful hunt and starvation. Bows were made from carefully selected wood, ash, juniper, or osage orange. The wood had to be straight-grained, free of knots, flexible but strong. Finding and preparing bow wood took time and knowledge. In winter, bows were inspected for cracks or damage. The wood was oiled with rendered fat to keep it from drying out and becoming brittle. The bowstring made from twisted sinew was checked for wear and replaced if necessary. Some bows were backed with sinew, a layer of sinew glued to the back of the bow to add strength and prevent it from breaking under the tension of the draw. This sinew backing had to be maintained, checked for separation or damage, and repaired if needed. Other tools were made from bone and antler. A bison leg bone, split and shaped, made an excellent hide scraper. Deer antler, carved and sharpened, became awls for punching holes in leather, or needles for sewing. Antler tines were shaped into fishhooks or toggles for clothing. The work was meditative. A man would sit by the fire, a piece of bone or antler in one hand, a sharp flake of stone in the other, and carefully shave away material. The work required concentration but not intense thought. The hands knew what to do. The mind could wander or engage in conversation, or simply rest in the rhythm of the work. Stone tools were also made. Knives, scrapers, drills. Each had its specific form and function, and each required skill to make well. The napper had to understand the stone, how it would break, where its flaws were, how to control the removal of flakes. The floor near the men's work areas would become littered with debris, stone flakes, wood shavings, scraps of sinew and leather. At intervals during the day, this debris was swept up, gathered in baskets, and carried out through the passageway to be deposited in the midden area outside the village. Children were always present in the lodge, woven into every aspect of daily life. Infants were kept close to their mothers, wrapped in soft furs made from rabbit or other small animals. Often they were placed in cradle boards, wooden frames with leather lacing that held the baby securely. The cradle board could be propped against a platform or hung from a lodge post, keeping the baby safe and comfortable while allowing the mother to work. Babies in winter were remarkably content. They were never cold. They were surrounded by warmth, by the sounds of family, by the smell of wood smoke and food. They nursed when hungry, slept when tired, and watched the movement of life around them with wide, curious eyes. Toddlers, once they could walk, had the run of the lodge. They played near the fire, supervised but given freedom to explore. They learned early to respect the fire, to understand its warmth but also its danger. A burn was a harsh teacher, but it was an effective one. They played with simple toys. Dolls were made from scraps of leather stuffed with dried grass or moss, dressed in tiny clothing sewn from leftover pieces. Carved wooden animals, bison, horses, wolves, were whittled by fathers and uncles during quiet moments. Small bows, made from curved willow branches with cord for bowstrings, allowed boys to practice shooting at targets made from bundled grass. But the real education happened through observation and gradual participation. A girl of 4 or 5 would sit beside her mother as she ground corn, watching the motion of the mano, listening to the sound it made. She would be given a tiny portion of corn and her own small grinding stone, perhaps just a smooth river rock and a piece of flat sandstone, and she would mimic the motion, crushing a few kernels, learning the feel of the work. By the time she was 7 or 8, she would be grinding corn regularly, contributing meaningfully to the family's meals. By 10 or 12, she would be skilled enough to grind efficiently, her hands strong, her technique refined. The same pattern held for all skills. A boy would watch his father knap stone first from a distance, then closer. He would be given his own small piece of stone and a striking tool. His first attempts would be clumsy, the flakes flying off in wrong directions, the stone shattering instead of shaping properly. But his father would be patient, correcting gently, showing him again and again the proper angle, the proper force. By adolescence, children were skilled workers. A girl of 14 could process a hide as well as any woman. A boy of 15 could make serviceable arrows and was learning the more advanced skills, knapping good stone points, making a bow, fletching arrows properly. This education required no formal teaching in the modern sense. There were no lessons, no scheduled instruction. Children simply lived alongside adults, absorbed the skills, practiced them gradually, and became competent through thousands of hours of observation and imitation. Children also had responsibilities. Older children were expected to help with daily tasks. A girl might be sent to fetch water, to stir the cooking pot, to watch younger siblings. A boy might be sent out on a clear day to gather firewood from the stacks near the lodge, to check snares that had been set for small game, to help carry in meat from a storage cache. These tasks were not seen as chores in a burdensome sense. They were simply part of life, part of being a member of the household. Everyone contributed according to their ability. Children also played together, inventing games, telling stories they had heard from the elders, and embellishing them with their own details. They would race around the lodge, play hide-and-seek among the sleeping platforms, wrestle gently near the fire under the watchful eyes of adults. On days when the weather was not too severe, children might be allowed outside for short periods. They would bundle up in furs, climb out through the passageway and play in the snow. They would slide down the gentle slopes of the lodge roofs, build snow figures, throw snowballs at each other, their laughter ringing clear in the cold air. When they came back inside, they would be flushed and breathless, stamping snow from their moccasins, their robes dusted with white. The cold would come in with them for a moment, a gust of frigid air. But the lodge's warmth quickly absorbed it, and the children would huddle by the fire, warming their hands and cheeks. As the day moved toward evening, as the pale shaft of light from the smoke hole dimmed and disappeared, the fire became the only source of light in the lodge. The work of the day slowed. Hands grew tired, eyes strained in the dimness. It was time to rest, to eat, and to gather. The evening meal was prepared in much the same way as the morning meal, but with more abundance. More corn, more meat, more time taken in the cooking. The women worked together, and the meal became a communal effort. When the food was ready, people gathered near the fire. The meal was eaten slowly with conversation. People talked about the day's work, how many hides had been processed, how many arrows had been made, whether the stored food was lasting as expected. They talked about the weather, whether it seemed to be getting colder or warmer, whether the snow was deepening, whether there were signs that spring might come early or late. They discussed practical matters, repairs that needed to be made to the lodge, tools that were running low and would need to be replaced, plans for the spring, when to begin preparing the fields, what to plant, where the bison herds might be when the hunting season returned. But as the meal ended and the fire was allowed to burn lower, the conversation often turned to stories. The elders were the keepers of the stories. They had heard them from their own elders when they were children, and those elders had heard them from the generation before. Some stories were so old that no one remembered when they had first been told. They had been passed down for so many generations that they predated the villages, predated the lodges, predated perhaps even the arrival of the people in this land. The stories served many purposes. Some explained the world, why the sun rose and set, why the seasons changed, why the bison came to the plains each year, why the stars were arranged in their patterns. These were cosmological stories, stories about the creation and structure of existence. Other stories were historical. They told of great migrations, of the people traveling from one land to another, crossing great distances, facing hardships. They told of great leaders, men and women who had guided the people through times of danger. They told of great battles against enemies, of alliances made and broken, of victories and defeats. Still other stories were instructional. They taught lessons about proper behavior, about the consequences of greed or selfishness or arrogance. Many of these stories featured trickster figures. Coyote was one, Raven was another. Characters who were foolish and clever at the same time, who made mistakes and suffered for them, and whose failures taught the listeners how to live better. The telling of a story was a kind of performance, though a subtle and restrained one. The elder would sit in a place of honor near the fire, and the others would gather around. Children would sit on the floor closest to the fire, arranged in a semicircle. Adults would sit on their sleeping platforms or on mats, positioned so they could see the elder's face. The elder's voice would fill the lodge. It was not a loud voice, not a shouting or dramatic voice. It was steady, measured, rhythmic. The elder spoke from memory, and the memory was precise. The stories were told in the same words, the same phrases every time. This exact repetition was how they were preserved. Certain passages would be repeated within the story for emphasis. Certain phrases had a particular cadence, a particular rhythm that made them memorable. The listeners, especially the children, would absorb these rhythms, and later, when they told the stories themselves, they would reproduce them exactly. The firelight played on the elder's face, on the faces of the listeners. Shadows moved on the earthen walls. The smoke rose steadily through the hole above. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the lodge, the fire, the voice, and the story. A single story might take half an hour to tell. Some of the longer, more complex stories took an hour or more. The listeners were patient. No one interrupted. No one spoke. Children who did not yet understand all the words still absorbed the rhythm, the tone, the cadence. They learned the shape of the story, and the meaning would come later as they grew. When a story ended, there was often a silence, a moment of stillness. Then, perhaps, someone would ask a question about a detail in the story, about its meaning. The elder would answer, or another elder might add their own interpretation. A discussion might unfold, quiet and thoughtful, or another story might begin, or the evening would simply move on, people drifting back to their own areas of the lodge, settling in for the night. The stories were not entertainment in a trivial sense. They were the transmission of culture. They were education, history, spiritual teaching, and moral instruction all woven together. They were how the people understood themselves, their place in the world, their relationship to the land and the animals and each other. And they were preserved through this process, through the exact repetition, the steady telling, the patient listening, generation after generation. Winter was also the season for sacred ceremonies. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples had complex spiritual traditions. They believed in a world filled with powers and spirits, in the power of the earth, the sky, the animals, the plants. They believed in the importance of maintaining proper relationships with these powers, of showing respect, of making offerings, of performing the rituals that kept the world in balance. Many of the most important ceremonies took place in winter. The lodge, warm and enclosed, was an ideal setting for these observances. Some ceremonies were small and domestic. A family might perform a ceremony to ensure good health for the coming year, or to honor a sacred bundle that had been passed down through the family. Sacred bundles were wrapped collections of objects, stones, feathers, small carvings, pieces of fur, each object holding spiritual significance. The bundle was carefully unwrapped. The objects were displayed and honored. Songs were sung, prayers were spoken, and offerings were made. Tobacco, food, small gifts. The smoke from burning tobacco was considered a carrier of prayers. As the smoke rose through the smoke hole, it carried the prayers upward, to the powers that governed the world. Other ceremonies were larger, involving multiple families or even the entire village. These were communal ceremonies. events that reinforced the bonds of the community and reaffirmed shared beliefs. The Okipa ceremony of the Mandan, for example, was a complex multi-day event that included fasting, dancing, and ritual ordeal. It was a reenactment of creation stories, a renewal of the world, and a test of the participants' spiritual commitment. Not all of the Okipa took place inside the lodges. Some parts required outdoor space, but much of the preparation, the preliminary rituals, and the storytelling that surrounded it happened inside in the warmth of the winter lodges. Ceremonies often included singing. Songs were as carefully preserved as stories, passed down through generations, sung in the same way every time. The songs had power. They connected the singers to the past, to their ancestors, to the spiritual forces they honored. Drumming accompanied many ceremonies. The drum was a simple instrument, a wooden frame with animal hide stretched tight across it, but its sound was profound. The steady beat, deep and resonant, filled the lodge, creating a physical sensation in the chest, a vibration that synchronized the listener's heartbeats. Dancing, when it occurred inside the lodge, was constrained by the space. It was not the wide, sweeping movement of outdoor dances. It was more subdued, more focused, the movement symbolic and precise. Dancers might wear special clothing or adornments, feathers, painted faces, necklaces of bone or shell. The ceremonies were serious but not somber. There was joy in them, a sense of connection and purpose. They were a way of participating in something larger than the individual, larger even than the community. They were a way of affirming that the people were part of the world, that they had responsibilities, and that they honored those responsibilities. To live in the lodge was to inhabit a specific sensory environment, one that shaped perception and experience in profound ways. The smell of the lodge was complex. The dominant note was wood smoke, but wood smoke itself was not a single smell. It varied depending on what was burning. Cottonwood smoke was clean and light, with a slightly sweet note. Willow was sharper, more acrid. When dried bison dung was burned as fuel, a common practice when wood was scarce, the smoke had a distinct, earthy smell, not unpleasant but different. Beneath the smoke was the smell of the earth itself. The walls, the floor, they gave off a mineral scent, slightly damp, cool, the smell of soil. It was a grounding smell, a reminder that the lodge was part of the earth, not separate from it. There was the smell of food. Corn cooking had its sweet, nutty aroma. Meat roasting over the fire added a savory, slightly charred note. The stored food in the pits contributed subtle smells, the mustiness of dried squash, the rich, almost funky smell of dried meat. Leather was everywhere. Robes, clothing, bags, storage containers. Smoked leather has a distinctive smell, woody and slightly sweet, pleasant and familiar. It was the smell of home in a sense, the smell of safety and warmth. And there was the smell of the people themselves. In close quarters, without frequent bathing, water was too precious and the cold too severe. Bodies had their own scent. It was not offensive, just present, part of the fabric of a life. Sweat, breath, hair, skin. These smells mingled with all the others. The sound of the lodge was equally distinctive. The fire was the constant background, the crackle and pop of burning wood, the soft hiss of sap heating and escaping, the occasional louder crack as a log split in the heat. Fire sounds are irregular, unpredictable, but constant. They create a kind of acoustic texture, a bed of sound on which other sounds rest. Human sounds filled the spaces between the fire sounds. Voices, kept low out of respect for the shared space. The murmur of conversation, laughter, sudden and bright, the sound of children playing, the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing, dozens of people breathing in their own rhythms. Work sounds were constant, the scrape of a tool on hide, the thud-thud-thud of the mano on the matate, the crack of stone being knapped, the rustle of movement, feet on the packed earth floor, the shift of a robe, the adjustment of position on a sleeping platform. And beyond all of this, barely audible, was the sound of the wind outside. On calm days it was absent, and the silence was profound. On stormy days, it was there, a low, distant roar, like the sound of a river far away, but always outside, always held at bay by the thick earth walls. The light in the lodge was dim and warm. Human eyes adapt remarkably well to low light, and after spending time in the lodge, the dimness ceased to feel like darkness. It simply felt like the natural state of Things. During the day, the light from the smoke hole was the primary source. It fell in a shaft, illuminating the area around the fire with a pale, indirect light. The light moved as the sun moved, creating a slow, graceful sweep across the floor, a kind of sundial marking the passage of time. At night, the fire was the only light. Flames cast a flickering orange-yellow glow. The light was warm in both temperature and colour. The yellow-orange end of the spectrum, the colour of sunset and candlelight, the colour that signals comfort and safety to human brains. The shadows cast by firelight are never still. They dance, shift, change shape as the flames move. This creates a sense of life, of movement, even when people are sitting still. Faces illuminated by firelight look different. The light comes from below, casting shadows upward, emphasizing the eyes, the cheekbones, the contours of the face. It is a flattering light, a kind light, one that makes everyone look warmer, softer, more human. The temperature in the lodge was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of its sensory environment. It was warm, but not uniformly so. There were zones, microclimates within the space. Near the fire, it was hot. Sitting close to the flames, you would feel the heat on your face, on your hands, on whatever part of your body was turned toward the fire. It was possible to be too hot, to need to turn away, to move back. A few feet from the fire, the temperature was comfortable, warm enough to sit without a robe, warm enough to work, to talk, to eat. Near the walls, the temperature dropped, not drastically, but noticeably. The earth walls, though they radiated stored heat, were also in contact with the cold ground outside, and some heat was lost through them. The air near the walls might be 10 or 15 degrees cooler than the air near the fire. The sleeping platforms raised off the floor and positioned against the walls were in this cooler zone. But the platforms themselves, piled with furs and robes, created warm nests. The body heat of the sleeper, trapped by the insulating furs, created a microclimate that was comfortable for sleep, cool enough that the body could rest without overheating, warm enough that there was no shivering, no discomfort. The air in the lodge was still, profoundly still. In modern buildings, there is always some air movement, from heating systems, from drafts, from ventilation. In the Earth Lodge, the air did not move unless someone moved through it. This stillness was palpable, almost physical. It contributed to the sense of enclosure, of peace, of being held. The humidity in the lodge was low. The fire dried the air, and the constant ventilation through the smoke hole prevented moisture from accumulating. This dryness was comfortable, not the parched, irritating dryness of forced air heating, but a clean, natural dryness that made the air feel fresh despite the lack of windows or doors. As winter progressed, as the days remained short and the cold remained absolute, life in the lodge settled into its deepest rhythm. There was a quality to midwinter that was distinct from early or late winter. In early winter, there was still the memory of autumn, the memory of outdoor life, of movement and change. In late winter, there was the anticipation of spring, the subtle signs of change, the lengthening days. But in the deep middle, in December, January, early February, there was a sense of timelessness. The days were all alike. The routine was constant. The world outside was frozen, unchanging, and inside life moved at its own pace, unrushed, patient, enduring. The stored food was consumed gradually, methodically. The storage pits were opened one by one, their contents brought out and used. As each pit was emptied, it was closed again, the wooden lid replaced, the mat laid back over it. The number of unopened pits diminished slowly, a physical representation of the passage of time. The people grew paler. Their skin, no longer exposed to the sun for hours each day, lost its summer colour. They grew quieter. The intensity of summer and fall, the constant activity, gave way to a more contemplative state. Conversations were softer, slower. There was less need for words when you lived so close together, when every gesture and expression was visible. The body adapted. Muscles that had been used for hard physical labour, running, lifting, digging, became less prominent. The body conserved energy, moving only as much as necessary. But this was not weakness. It was efficiency. The body was husbanding its resources, preparing to endure. Dreams became more vivid. The long hours of sleep, the darkness, the warmth, all of these created conditions for deep, extended dreaming. People would wake in the morning and share their dreams, discussing their meanings, seeking interpretation from the elders. Some dreams were considered significant, messages from the spirit world. If a person dreamed of a particular animal, or a particular place, or a particular event, it might be seen as guidance, as a sign that should be heeded. These dreams were taken seriously, discussed, sometimes acted upon. The elders especially seemed to come into their own in deep winter. The cold that had been so hard on them in their younger years was now held at bay by the lodge. Their joints, which ached in the cold, were soothed by the steady warmth. They had the time and the audience to pass on everything they knew, the stories, the skills, the wisdom accumulated over decades. They were honoured. They were fed first. They sat in the places of greatest warmth. They spoke, and others listened. This was their season. Young children too thrived in the lodge. They were never cold, never hungry. They were surrounded by family, by attention, by security. They learned constantly, absorbing language, skills, social norms. Winter was a time of rapid development for them, a time when they transformed from infants to children, from children to young people. For adults in their prime, the hunters, the farmers, the builders, winter was a time of rest. The intense physical demands of the other seasons were lifted. They could sleep longer, work at a slower pace, recover from injuries, regain strength. This rest was not laziness. It was strategic. It was preparation for the intense work that would come with spring. The communal nature of the lodge was perhaps its most important feature. 20, 30, 40 people living in a single space. This required more than just physical proximity. It required social structures, shared norms, mutual respect, and a constant, subtle negotiation of needs and desires. The lodge was organized by family relationships. Extended families occupied sections of the lodge together. A grandmother, her daughters, their husbands, their children, all might share a quarter of the lodge's circle. These family groups had their own sleeping platforms, their own storage pits, their own sense of space. But the boundaries were not rigid. The lodge was a single, unified space. The fire at the center belonged to everyone. The warmth belonged to everyone. The smoke hole, the passageway, the floor, these were shared. Cooperation was essential. Wood had to be gathered and brought in, and this was a task shared by all the men and older boys. The fire had to be maintained, and anyone passing by would add wood if the flames were low. Food preparation was shared among the women, each contributing according to her ability and taking according to her family's needs. Conflicts did arise. Living in such close quarters, disagreements were inevitable. Perhaps two families had a dispute over the use of a storage pit. Perhaps a child from one family had damaged something belonging to another. Perhaps there was jealousy or perceived unfairness in the distribution of resources. These conflicts were handled carefully. Public confrontation was discouraged. The acoustic properties of the lodge meant that every raised voice would be heard by everyone, creating discomfort and tension. Instead, disputes were handled quietly, through mediation. The elders served as mediators. If two families had a problem, they would bring it to the respected leaders of the lodge, usually the oldest men and women, those who had the most experience, who had seen many winters, who understood the importance of harmony. The elders would listen to both sides. They would ask questions, they would consider, and then they would offer a judgment, a solution, a path forward. Their authority came not from force, but from respect, and because they were respected, their decisions were accepted. Serious conflicts, those that could not be resolved through mediation, were rare. The people understood that harmony was not optional. It was necessary. The lodge required cooperation to function. A family that consistently caused problems, that refused to participate in communal work, that violated the shared norms, such a family might find itself asked to leave, to build their own lodge, to live separately. But this was rare. Most people understood the rules, honoured them, and lived according to them. There was also joy in the communal life. The lodge was not a place of grim endurance. There was laughter. There were jokes. People teased each other gently, played games, sang songs. Young, people flirted. Courtships developed. Marriages were arranged. Babies were born. Life continued, not despite the winter, but within it. The lodge held all of this, the whole texture of human life, compressed into a single warm space, sustained by the earth itself. The warmth inside the earth lodge was not like the warmth of a modern heated room. It was different in quality, in steadiness, in the way it surrounded you. The fire provided direct heat, of course. When it was burning well, the area immediately around the fire pit was warm, even hot. But the fire was not the only source of warmth. The walls themselves were warm. Heavy materials, stone, earth, clay, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Lightweight materials, fabric, thin wood, air, do not. A thin hide wall like that of a teepee has very little mass. When a fire is burning inside, the hide warms slightly, but it does not store that heat. As soon as the fire dies down, the hide cools rapidly and the interior temperature drops. The earth walls of a lodge, by contrast, are heavy. A foot-thick layer of soil, sod and clay has immense mass. When the fire burns, heat radiates outward from the flames. Some of that heat warms the air directly, but much of it strikes the earthen walls and is absorbed. The heat does not stop at the surface. It penetrates slowly into the mass of the earth, warming not just the inner surface but the layers beyond. Heat moves through solid materials by conduction, molecule by molecule. The process is slow. It can take hours for heat to move even a few inches through dense earth, but it is steady. As the earth warms, it becomes a reservoir. It holds heat, and once it is warm, it does not cool quickly. Even after the fire dies down, even after the flames are reduced to coals, the walls remain warm, and warm materials radiate heat. This radiant heat is gentle and even. It does not blow. It does not create drafts. It simply radiates outward, in all directions from every part of the warm surface. The result is a lodge that stays warm through the night, even when the fire has burned low. The walls give back the heat they absorb during the day. Understanding how the earth lodge worked requires understanding some basic principles of heat transfer. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. If you place your hand on a hot stone, heat moves from the stone to your hand by conduction. The molecules in the stone are vibrating rapidly because they are hot. When they contact the molecules in your skin, they transfer some of their energy, and your hand warms. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids, liquids or gases. When air near a fire is heated, it becomes less dense and rises. Cooler, denser air flows in to take its place, is heated in turn, and also rises. This creates a circulation pattern, a current of air that moves heat from the fire to other parts of the space. Radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. The fire emits infrared radiation, which travels through the air, even through empty space, and is absorbed by any surface it strikes. That surface warms, even if there is no direct contact and no air movement. In the earth lodge, all three mechanisms were at work. The fire radiated heat outward in all directions. This radiant heat struck the earthen walls, the wooden posts, the people sitting near the fire. It warmed them directly, without needing to warm the air first. The fire also warmed the air through convection. Hot air rose, creating a gentle circulation that distributed warmth throughout the space. But because the lodge was enclosed and still, this convection was limited. The air did not rush around. It moved slowly, gently, and most of the heat stayed near the fire rather than being swept away. The earthen walls, once warmed by the radiant heat from the fire, held that heat through their mass, and they conducted it slowly inward, deeper into the earth, but they also radiated it back into the lodge. A warm surface radiates infrared energy to cooler surfaces nearby. The warm walls radiated heat back toward the center of the lodge, toward the people, toward the cooler air. This created a balanced system. During the day, when the fire was burning well, the walls absorbed heat. At night, when the fire was low, the walls released heat. The temperature swings were minimized. The environment stayed stable. The thermal behavior of the lodge followed a predictable daily pattern. In the early morning, around dawn, the lodge was at its coolest point. The fire had been burning low all night, kept at coals to conserve wood. The walls had been radiating their stored heat for 8 or 10 hours. They were still warm, but less warm than they had been at sunset. The air temperature in the lodge at this time might be around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit near the walls, 60 to 65 degrees near the fire. Outside, the temperature might be 10 below zero, 20 below, even 40 below. The difference was profound. A 70-degree thermal protection provided by the structure. When the fire was rebuilt in the morning, the warming process began. The flames grew. Heat radiated outward. The air near the fire warmed quickly. Within minutes, it might reach 70 degrees or more. But the walls took longer. The inner surface began to warm first, but slowly. After an hour, the surface of the earthen wall closest to the fire might have warmed by 5 degrees. After 2 hours, 10 degrees. The heat soaked inward, gradually into the mass. By midday, the fire had been burning steadily for several hours. The air temperature near the fire was stable, perhaps 75 degrees. The walls had warmed considerably. The inner surface was now warm to the touch. If you placed your hand flat against the earthen wall, you would feel warmth radiating back against your palm. This was the peak of the warming cycle. The system was in balance. Heat was being added by the fire at roughly the same rate it was being stored in the walls and lost through the roof and the smoke hole. In the afternoon, the fire might be tended less frequently, allowed to burn slightly lower. The walls, now fully warm, continued to radiate heat. The temperature remained stable. In the evening, as darkness fell, the fire was banked. Wood was added, but not a large amount. The fire was arranged to burn slowly through the night. The flames died down to a steady glow of coals. But the lodge did not cool rapidly. The walls, having absorbed heat all day, now released it. The inner surface radiated infrared energy inward, toward the center of the lodge, toward the people preparing for sleep. The air temperature dropped slightly, perhaps from 70 degrees to 65 degrees over the course of a few hours. But the drop was gradual, gentle. There was no sudden chill. Through the night, the walls continued to radiate. The temperature continued to drop, but slowly. By morning, the lodge was cooler, but it was never cold. The cycle was complete, and it would begin again. The difference between the earth lodge and a lightweight structure can be quantified. In a teepee, the heat capacity of the structure itself is minimal. A typical teepee might have 500 pounds of hide covering. Hide has a low specific heat. It takes relatively little energy to warm it up, and it releases that energy quickly. If a fire adds heat to the interior of a teepee, most of that heat warms the air. Some warms the hide surface slightly. But within an hour of the fire dying down, most of that heat has been lost, escaping through the smoke hole, through gaps in the hide, through conduction through the thin walls. In an earth lodge, the mass of the structure is enormous. The earthen roof alone might weigh 50 tons or more. Earth has a relatively high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to warm it up, but once warm, it holds that energy for a long time. When the fire adds heat to the interior of an earth lodge, much of that heat is absorbed by the earthen walls and roof. It is stored in the mass, and it is released slowly, over many hours. This means the earth lodge requires less fuel to maintain a comfortable temperature. The fire does not need to burn as hot or as constantly. Estimates suggest that an earth lodge might use 1/3 to 1/2 the fuel of a teepee to maintain similar comfort levels in the same conditions. This fuel efficiency was significant. In a landscape where trees were scarce, where gathering wood in deep snow was dangerous and exhausting, using less fuel meant less work, less risk, more time for other activities. The thermal mass was only part of the story. The earth lodge also relied on insulation to reduce heat loss. Insulation works by trapping air. Still air is a poor conductor of heat, which means it resists the flow of heat. Materials that trap air, creating many small pockets of still air, are effective insulators. The earth lodge had multiple insulating layers. The willow matting laid over the wooden rafters created a layer of trapped air between the rafters and the earth above. Willow is flexible, and the woven mats were not perfectly flat. They created small air gaps, pockets where air could be trapped and remain still. The prairie grass, bundled and laid over the willow, created another layer. Grass, like all plant material, has a cellular structure filled with air. Bundled grass creates a thick, spongy layer that resists heat flow. The earth itself, though not as effective an insulator as grass or trapped air, still provided resistance to heat loss. Dry soil has an R value of roughly 0.25 per inch of thickness. A foot of earth, 12 inches, would have an R value of about 3. This is modest by modern standards, but it is not nothing. But the most effective insulator was the snow. Snow is remarkable. Fresh fluffy snow might be 90% air by volume. The ice crystals are small and form a delicate three-dimensional lattice. Within this lattice, air is trapped in countless tiny pockets. The insulating value of snow depends on its density. Fresh snow, very light and fluffy, might have an R value of 1 per inch. Denser, settled snow might have an R value of 0.5 per inch. A layer of snow 3 feet thick, 36 inches, might have an R value between 15 and 30, depending on density. This is comparable to a modern insulated wall. The snow, therefore, was not just tolerated. It was welcomed. It was actively helpful. The deeper the snow on the roof, the more effective the insulation, the warmer the lodge interior, and the snow cost nothing. It required no labour to create, no materials to gather. It simply fell, and it provided its benefit freely. The shape of the earth lodge contributed to its thermal performance in another way, by minimising wind-driven heat loss. Wind strips heat from surfaces through a process called forced convection. Moving air removes the thin boundary layer of warm air that clings to a surface, replacing it with cold air. This increases the rate of heat transfer dramatically. A flat wall, exposed to wind, experiences high rates of heat loss. The wind strikes the wall, creates turbulence, and actively pulls heat away. The earth lodge was designed to avoid this. First, it was low. The typical earth lodge rose only 8 to 10 feet above the surrounding grade. This put the majority of the structure below the level of the strongest winds, which tend to blow fastest at about 10 to 20 feet above the ground. Second, it was round. A sphere or hemisphere is the most aerodynamic shape. Wind encountering a curved surface does not strike it directly. Instead, the wind flows over and around the curve. The surface is always tangent to the direction of flow, minimizing turbulence. Third, the earth covering made the surface continuous and smooth. There were no sharp edges, no corners, no projections for the wind to catch. The lodge presented to the wind as a smooth, low mound. The result was minimal forced convection. Even in high winds, 40, 50 miles per hour, the wind flowed over the lodge without significantly increasing heat loss. The lodge simply presented too little surface area, at too gentle an angle for the wind to grip. The floor of the earth lodge also contributed to thermal comfort, though in a subtle way. The floor was excavated to a depth of 2 to 4 feet below the surface. This placed it below the frost line. The ground at this depth did not freeze. It remained at a stable temperature year-round, usually just above the freezing point of water, around 33 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. This seems cold, and by the standards of human comfort, it is cold. But it is not as cold as the air temperature outside, which might be 40 below. The floor, therefore, was not a heat sink in the way frozen ground would be. It was not actively pulling heat away from the space above it. It was, in a sense, neutral, neither adding heat nor removing it rapidly. But there was a subtle geothermal contribution. At depths of 6 feet or more, the ground temperature is warmer, closer to 45 or 50 degrees in this region. The geothermal gradient, the increase in temperature with depth, means that heat is constantly flowing upward through the earth, from the warmer depths toward the cooler surface. The floor of the lodge, at a depth of 3 or 4 feet, was in the middle of this gradient. Heat was flowing upward through the floor from the warmer earth below. The amount of heat was small, perhaps equivalent to a few watts per square foot, but it was constant, and it added up. This geothermal heat was enough to keep the floor from being uncomfortably cold. Standing barefoot on the packed earth floor of an earth lodge in midwinter would feel cool but not painful. Sitting on the floor, on a mat or a folded robe, would be tolerable. More importantly, it meant the sleeping platforms raised a foot or two above the floor were in an environment where the floor was not actively stealing heat. The air near the floor was stable, not frigidly cold. Despite the overall warmth and stability of the earth lodge, there were temperature variations within the space. These variations were predictable and were used by the inhabitants to find the level of comfort they desired. The hottest zone was immediately around the fire. Within 3 or 4 feet of the flames, the air temperature might reach 75 or 80 degrees during the day. This was the warmest spot in the lodge, the place where people gathered when they were cold, where they worked when they needed maximum warmth. Moving outward from the fire, the temperature dropped gradually. At a distance of 10 feet from the fire, the air temperature might be 65 or 70 degrees. This was a comfortable zone for most activities: sitting, talking, eating. At 15 or 20 feet from the fire near the walls, the temperature dropped further, perhaps to 55 or 60 degrees. This was cooler, but still far warmer than outside. The sleeping platforms positioned against the walls and raised off the floor were in this cooler zone. But this was actually ideal for sleep. The human body generates heat, and sleeping under heavy robes in a warm environment can lead to overheating. The slightly cooler air near the sleeping platforms meant that people could sleep comfortably under thick furs without becoming too warm. The air also stratified by temperature. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. In the earth lodge, the warmest air accumulated near the top of the domed roof, just below the smoke hole. The coolest air was near the floor, especially in the passageway entrance. This stratification was beneficial. The warm air at the top rose naturally and exited through the smoke hole, carrying smoke with it. The cooler air at the bottom remained still, providing a comfortable environment at the level where people lived and worked. The thermal performance of the earth lodge varied somewhat with the seasons, though far less than an above-ground structure. In early winter, November-December, the earth itself was still relatively warm from the summer sun. The ground had absorbed solar heat for 6 months, and it took time for that heat to dissipate. The earthen walls of the lodge in early winter were warmer than they would be later. They absorbed heat from the fire quickly and radiated it back effectively. As winter deepened, January-February, the ground outside cooled. The frost line deepened. The outer portions of the earthen walls grew colder. Heat loss through the walls increased slightly. There was now a greater temperature difference between the inside and the outside, driving a faster flow of heat outward. But the snow compensated. By midwinter, the lodge was typically buried under several feet of snow. This snow layer provided additional insulation that offset the increased heat loss through the walls. The net result was that the lodge remained comfortable throughout the winter, with only modest variations in interior temperature. In late winter, March, early April, the cycle began to reverse. The sun, climbing higher each day, began to warm the surface. The snow on the roof absorbed solar heat during the day. Some of this heat was conducted inward, adding to the warmth provided by the fire. By early spring, the lodge required very little heating. The fire could be kept small, almost symbolic. The warming earth and the returning sun provided enough ambient heat that the interior remained comfortable even without a large fire. Viewed from a modern perspective, the Earth Lodge was a masterwork of passive environmental design. Passive design means working with natural forces rather than against them. It means using the properties of materials, mass, insulation, conductivity, to create comfort without mechanical systems. The Earth Lodge did this perfectly. It used the stable temperature of the Earth itself as a baseline, placing the living space below the frost line. It employed massive thermal storage to buffer temperature swings, storing heat during the day and releasing it at night. It used layers of natural insulation, grass, earth, snow, to resist heat loss. It minimized wind exposure through its low profile and aerodynamic shape. It used the stack effect, the natural tendency of warm air to rise, to ventilate the space, removing smoke while retaining heat. All of this was achieved without pumps, without thermostats, without furnaces, without any technology beyond simple hand tools and accumulated knowledge. The people who built these lodges did not think in terms of R values or thermal mass or convection currents, but their empirical understanding, gained through generations of observation and refinement, led them to create structures that perfectly embodied these principles. This was not primitive. This was sophisticated. It was a solution that worked with the environment rather than trying to dominate it. It was efficient, effective, and elegant. And it worked so well that families could live comfortably through the coldest months, could sleep deeply and restfully, could maintain their culture and community, even when the world outside was colder than most modern people will ever experience. The Missouri River Earth Lodges were one solution to the problem of winter. Hundreds of miles to the west, in a different landscape, another solution had been developed. The Plateau country of the interior Northwest, present-day British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, is a land of high basins, river valleys, and pine-covered hills. The elevation is higher than the plains. The winters are colder, often harsher. The landscape is different, the resources are different, but the fundamental challenge is the same: how to survive months of cold so deep that it can kill. The peoples of this region, among them the Syilx, also known as the Okanagan, and the Secwepemc, also known as the Shuswap, developed a structure called the pit house. In some languages, it was called the Kiguli. The pit house shared the same core principle as the Earth Lodge: go underground, use the Earth's stable temperature, insulate with mass. But the form was different, the construction was different, and the experience of living in one was different. Where the Missouri River Earth Lodge was broad and communal, the pit house was deeper and more contained. Where the Earth Lodge had a side entrance, the pit house had only one way in or out, straight down through the roof. The Plateau winter was not just cold, it was buried. Snow fell deep and stayed, 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet in some areas. The snow covered the ground, the trees, the hills. It erased the landscape. In this environment, a structure that disappeared entirely under the snow was not a problem. It was an advantage. Building a pit house began the same way as building an earth lodge, by digging. But the excavation was deeper, much deeper. A circle was marked on the ground, 30 feet across, 40, 50, sometimes 60 for a large communal pit house. Then the digging began. Not 2 or 3 feet down, but 6 feet, 8 feet, sometimes more. This was an enormous undertaking. Moving that much earth, with digging sticks and simple tools, required weeks of labor and the effort of many people. The soil was piled around the rim of the pit, forming a low ridge. The floor was leveled, packed hard. When the pit was complete, it was a deep, circular bowl carved into the earth. Standing at the bottom and looking up, you could see the walls of soil rising around you, the sky a circle above. The next step was to build the roof. A framework of heavy logs was constructed. The structure was conical, shaped like a broad, low cone. Large support posts were set into the floor near the center of the pit, forming a ring. From these posts, angled rafters were laid, extending outward and upward to rest on the rim of the pit. The angle was steep enough to shed snow, but not so steep that it required excessive materials. Additional rafters were laid between the main supports, creating a dense, interlocking framework. The center of the cone was left open, a smoke hole, just as in the Earth Lodge. Over this wooden skeleton, layers of covering were applied. First, smaller branches and split planks were laid across the rafters, creating a more continuous surface. Then a thick layer of grass or reeds, similar to thatch. Then, earth. The earth was piled on thick, a foot, sometimes more. It was tamped down, packed solid. More earth was added around the base, connecting the roof to the surrounding ground. When complete, the entire structure was covered. From the outside, it looked like a low, rounded mound with a hole at the top. As winter came and the snow fell, the pit house disappeared. The mound became indistinguishable from the surrounding snow-covered landscape. Only the smoke rising from the hole at the apex gave away the presence of life below. The most striking feature of the pit house was how you entered it. There was no door, no passageway tunneling in from the side. The only entrance was the smoke hole at the very top of the roof. A ladder provided access. It was a single, large log, often a stripped pine or fir trunk, with deep notches cut into it at regular intervals. The notches served as steps. The ladder was angled steeply, almost vertical, and it extended from the ground outside down through the smoke hole into the interior of the pit house. To enter, you climbed up onto the snow-covered roof, approached the smoke hole, and began your descent. You placed your feet in the notches, gripping the sides of the log, and climbed down. As you descended, you passed through the column of smoke rising from the fire below. The smoke was warm. It smelled of wood, pine, fir, cottonwood, whatever was burning. It rose in a steady stream around you, finding its way out into the cold air above. You climbed down through this smoke, through the warmth, and then your feet touched the floor. You stepped off the ladder into the interior of the pit house. The descent was a ritual. It was a transition. You left the frozen, white, wind-scoured world above and entered the warm, dim, earth-enclosed world below. Every time you came home, you made this journey. Every morning when you left, you climbed back up, emerging from the smoke into the cold light. The symbolism was clear. The pit house was a return to the earth, a descent into safety, a form of shelter that was not built on top of the world but carved into it. The interior of the pit house was shaped by its construction. It was a bowl, circular with gently sloping or stepped walls, and a domed roof overhead. The floor was the bottom of the excavated pit, packed smooth and hard. In the centre, directly beneath the smoke hole and the ladder, was the fire pit. It was often lined with stones to contain the heat and protect the wooden ladder from stray embers. The fire burned constantly, day and night, though its intensity varied. During the day, when people were active, it was built up. At night, it was allowed to burn down to coals. The smoke rose steadily, drawn upward by the natural draft created by the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cold air outside. Around the perimeter of the pit, against the earth walls, sleeping platforms had been built. These were raised slightly off the floor, made of wooden planks or poles covered with mats and furs. The platforms were where people slept, where they sat during the day, where they kept their personal belongings. The earth walls themselves were sometimes lined with woven mats made from tule reeds or cattails. These mats provided additional insulation and kept dirt from crumbling into the living space. They also made the walls smoother, more finished. The pit house could house many people. A large pit house might hold 20, 30, even 40 people, depending on its size. Families occupied sections of the perimeter, each with their own sleeping area, but the fire and the central space were communal. The temperature inside was stable. The deep excavation meant the floor was well below the frost line, sitting on ground that remained above freezing year-round. The thick earthen roof and the insulating layer of snow above provided a massive thermal barrier. The fire, though small, was enough to keep the interior comfortably warm. The air was still. There was no wind, no drafts. The only movement was the rising of the smoke and the gentle stirring caused by people moving about. The light was dim. It came only from the fire and the smoke hole above. During the day, a shaft of pale daylight fell through the smoke hole, illuminating the ladder and the area around the fire. At night, the only light was the glow of the coals and the flames. The daily life in the pit house followed patterns recognizable from the earth lodge: fire tending, food preparation, handwork, but the specific resources reflected the plateau environment. The plateau peoples were hunter-gatherers. They did not farm in the way the Missouri River peoples did. They did not grow corn or beans. Instead, their economy was based on fishing, hunting, and the gathering of wild plant foods. Salmon was the cornerstone. The rivers of the plateau, the Columbia, the Fraser, the Thompson, and their tributaries, hosted enormous salmon runs. In late summer and early autumn, millions of salmon would swim upstream from the ocean to spawn. The water would be thick with fish, so dense that you could almost walk across the river on their backs. The peoples of the plateau caught these fish in vast numbers. They used dip nets, spears, fish weirs, structures built across the river to channel and trap the fish. A single family might catch and process hundreds of fish in a season. The fish were cleaned immediately. The flesh was filleted from the bones, producing long strips of rich, oily meat. These strips were hung on wooden racks and dried in the sun and wind. The drying process took days, sometimes weeks. The fish had to be protected from flies and scavengers, watched constantly, turned to ensure even drying. When fully dried, the salmon was hard, almost brittle, dark in colour, with a concentrated, intense flavour. It was incredibly nutritious, high in protein, high in omega-3 fatty acids, stable for long-term storage. The dried salmon was packed into baskets or wrapped in bark, then stored in underground caches. These caches were pits dug into the earth, lined with bark or grass to keep the contents dry, covered with earth and stones. The cold of the plateau winter acted as a natural refrigerator, keeping the fish preserved for months. When food was needed during the winter, a cache would be opened. This was cold, hard work. The frozen earth had to be chipped away with digging sticks or stone tools. The covering had to be removed. The fish were brought out stiff and frozen and carried into the pit house. Inside, near the fire, the fish thawed. The dried strips would soften slightly, making them easier to tear into pieces. Some fish was eaten as jerky, chewed slowly, the intense flavour filling the mouth. Other fish was added to cooking pots, where it would rehydrate in boiling water, breaking down into flakes that could be mixed with roots and other foods. The taste of dried salmon was distinct, smoky if it had been smoked, fishy but not unpleasantly so, rich and satisfying. It was a taste of autumn, of the rivers, of abundance stored against the winter. Game was also important. Deer, elk, mountain sheep and smaller animals were hunted in the autumn. The meat was dried and stored in the same way as the salmon. Dried venison was leaner than salmon, less oily, but equally nutritious. Plant foods were gathered in late summer and autumn. The most important were roots. Camas was a staple. The camas plant produces a bulb that is starchy and sweet when cooked. Thousands of these bulbs were dug each year using digging sticks from the meadows where the plant grew. The bulbs were then pit roasted, cooked in earth ovens lined with hot stones, for 1 to 3 days. This slow cooking transformed the starch into sugar, making the bulbs sweet and digestible. The cooked camas bulbs were then dried and stored. In winter, they could be rehydrated by soaking in water or added directly to stews. Bitterroot was another important root food. The root was dug in spring, peeled and dried. It had a slightly bitter taste, hence the name, but it was nutritious and filling. Wild onions, yampa and other roots were also gathered and dried. Berries were collected in summer. Service berries, huckleberries, chokecherries. These were dried into small hard pellets that could be stored in bags and added to meals for sweetness and variety. The pit house, therefore, smelled different from the earth lodge. Instead of the aroma of cooking corn, there was the rich, oily smell of rehydrating salmon. Instead of dried squash, there was the earthy smell of boiled roots. But the underlying pattern was the same. Food gathered and preserved in the warm months, stored in caches, brought out as needed, prepared over the central fire, shared among the community. The Plateau peoples were master basket makers. Baskets served almost every purpose in daily life. They were used for gathering, carrying berries, roots, fish. They were used for storage, holding dried food, tools, clothing. They were used for cooking. Some baskets were woven so tightly they could hold water, and hot stones dropped into the water-filled basket would bring it to a boil. The baskets were made from roots, cedar roots, spruce roots. The roots were gathered in spring or summer when they were pliable. They were dug carefully from the ground, cleaned, split into long, thin strands, and stored until needed. The weaving was intricate. The most common technique was coiling, a spiral construction where a foundation of bundled material was wrapped with a finer strand, stitched through the previous coil to hold everything together. The work required patience, skill, and strong hands. A woman would sit by the fire, the foundation bundle in one hand, the wrapping strand in the other, and stitch, 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 building the basket slowly, coil by coil, from the bottom up. The basket grew gradually, taking shape over days of work. The finest baskets were beautiful objects, tightly woven, symmetrical, decorated with patterns created by using different colors of root material or by incorporating dyed strands. These baskets were works of art as well as functional tools. Men worked with wood, bone, and stone. The plateau had abundant timber, pine, fir, cedar. Wood was used for almost everything: fishing spears, digging sticks, the frames of the pit houses, the support posts, the ladders. All of these were made from wood. Woodworking tools were simple: stone axes and adzes for shaping, scrapers for smoothing, fire for hollowing. A canoe, for example, might be made by selecting a large cedar log, burning and scraping out the interior, shaping the exterior, creating a vessel that was light, strong, and elegant. Smaller items, bowls, spoons, handles for tools, were carved during the winter months. A man would sit by the fire with a piece of wood and a sharp stone blade, carving slowly, patiently, letting the form emerge from the material. Stone tools were essential. The plateau had excellent stone for knapping, obsidian in particular. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when properly knapped, it can be sharper than steel. The knapping techniques were the same as on the plains: careful striking, controlled flaking, gradual shaping. But the quality of the stone made the work easier, and the resulting tools were superb, razor-sharp, beautiful, functional. Bone and antler were also worked into tools. Fishing hooks, awls, needles, toggles, these were carved and shaped during the long winter days. The ladder entrance of the pit house shaped daily life in ways both practical and symbolic. Each morning someone had to climb up to assess the weather, to bring in firewood from the stacks nearby to check the caches. The climb was steep and required care. The ladder was a single log, its notches worn smooth by thousands of ascents and descents. In winter, frost or ice could make the ladder slippery. A person climbing had to grip firmly, Place their feet carefully, move deliberately. At the top, emerging through the smoke hole, the contrast was immediate. Inside, warmth, dim firelight, the smell of wood smoke and earth. Outside, blinding white snow, sharp cold, wind that bit at exposed skin. The person emerging would pause for a moment, adjusting to the cold, then attend to whatever task had brought them outside. Wood was gathered, split logs stored under a covering near the pit house. Snow was collected for melting into water. The caches might be checked or opened if more food was needed. Then the descent back down, back through the smoke, back into the warmth. The transition was always profound, a reminder of the protection the pit house provided, of the sanctuary it represented. Children learned to climb the ladder as soon as they were able. By age 4 or 5, they could manage it with supervision. By age 7 or 8, they could climb alone. This was a rite of passage, a marker of growing capability. The very young and the very old did not climb. Infants were carried. Elders, if they were too frail to climb safely, simply stayed inside for weeks at a time, content to remain in the warmth and let others handle the outdoor tasks. The ladder also had symbolic weight. It connected two worlds, the world above, of sky and weather and danger, and the world below, of earth and fire and safety. To descend was to return to the womb of the earth, to be held and protected. To ascend was to be born back into the world, to face its challenges again. This symbolism was not lost on the people. It was woven into their stories, their spiritual understanding, their sense of identity. The storytelling tradition of the Plateau was rich and distinctive. Many stories featured Coyote, the trickster figure central to the mythology of many indigenous peoples of the western part of the continent. Coyote was clever and foolish, generous and selfish, creative and destructive, a complex character who embodied the contradictions of human nature. Coyote stories were teaching stories. They illustrated proper and improper behavior through the adventures and misadventures of the trickster. Coyote would see something he wanted and scheme to get it. His schemes would often work, but they would also often backfire, leaving him worse off than before. The lesson about greed, or pride, or dishonesty was clear. But Coyote was also a creator figure. In some stories, Coyote shaped the landscape, created the rivers, taught the salmon to run upstream, showed human beings how to catch and preserve them. He was a bridge between the spirit world and the human world, a figure of power and foolishness all at once. The stories were told in the evenings, in the firelight, with the people gathered around. The teller would sit near the fire, and the listeners would arrange themselves on their sleeping platforms or on mats on the floor. The telling had a particular rhythm, a particular cadence. Certain phrases were repeated. And then Coyote said, or now you know why, phrases that marked transitions in the story that gave it structure. The listeners responded. At certain points in the story they might interject, a word of affirmation, a sound of recognition. This call and response was part of the performance, a way of showing that the listeners were engaged, that the story was alive. Children absorbed these stories deeply. The stories taught them about the world, about the animals, the plants, the landscape. They taught about relationships, between people, between humans and animals, between the living and the spiritual. The stories were entertainment, but they were also education, history, and spiritual instruction. The pit house created a sensory environment that was even more enclosed than the earth lodge. The smell was distinctive. Wood smoke, as always, was the dominant note. But the smoke of pine and fir had a different quality than the smoke of cottonwood. Sharper, more resinous, with a hint of sap. Mixed with the smoke was the smell of fish. Not strong, not unpleasant, but present. Dried salmon has a persistent smell, slightly oily, slightly smoky. It permeated the baskets, the mats, the air itself. There was the smell of the earth walls, damp and mineral, and the smell of the tulle mats that lined the walls, a grassy vegetal smell, clean and fresh. The sound in the pit house was muffled. The deep excavation, the thick earthen roof, the snow piled above, all of these absorbed sound. The world outside was silent. Inside, sounds were intimate, close. The fire crackled. Voices were low and soft. The sounds of work, scraping, carving, weaving, were gentle, rhythmic. The pit house was a quiet place, a place where sound did not carry, where conversations felt private even in a communal space. The light was even dimmer than in the earth lodge. The only light came from the fire and the smoke hole. The shaft of daylight from above was a narrow column, illuminating the ladder and the area immediately around the fire. The sleeping platforms, arranged around the perimeter, were in near darkness. This dimness was not oppressive, it was restful. The eyes adjusted. The firelight was warm and gentle. The darkness at the edges of the space created a sense of intimacy, of enclosure. The temperature was stable and comfortable. The bowl shape of the pit house concentrated warmth at the bottom. Heat rose naturally, but it did not escape rapidly. The smoke hole was small, and the column of rising smoke and hot air was narrow. The sleeping platforms against the earth walls were in a slightly cooler zone, ideal for sleep. The walls, warmed by the fire during the day, radiated heat back at night. The floor, deep below the frost line, was stable and not uncomfortably cold. Living in a pit house was to live in profound intimacy with others. The space was more constrained than the earth lodge. The bowl shape meant that people were closer together, both horizontally and vertically. There was less room to create physical distance. This required careful social navigation. Respect for personal space, even in close quarters, was essential. People learned to signal their need for privacy by positioning themselves in a particular way, by draping a hide or mat to create a visual barrier, by simply withdrawing into silence. Conflicts were resolved quickly and quietly. The elders mediated, as in the earth lodge, but the pressure to maintain harmony was even greater. There was simply no way to avoid someone you were in conflict with. The space was too small, the interactions too constant. But the intimacy also created strong bonds. People knew each other deeply, their habits, their moods, their strengths and weaknesses. The community was tightly knit, bound together by the shared experience of the long winter, the shared warmth of the pit house, the shared descent into the earth. Children grew up in this environment, surrounded by family, by elders, by the constant presence of others. They learned social skills early, how to read moods, how to speak appropriately, how to contribute without being intrusive. The pit house was a crucible of community, a space that demanded cooperation and rewarded it with security and warmth. The days in the pit house followed a predictable rhythm, shaped by the light from above and the needs of the body. Morning began with someone climbing the ladder to check the weather and bring in wood. The fire was rebuilt. Water was melted from snow. Food was prepared. Midday was the time for work. Baskets were woven. Tools were made. Hides were processed. The light from the smoke hole was at its best, a strong, clear shaft that illuminated the central area. Afternoon was quieter. The work continued, but at a slower pace. Children played. Elders rested. The fire was tended, the evening meal was begun. Evening was the social time. The meal was eaten, stories were told, the fire was allowed to burn low. People moved to their sleeping platforms, wrapped themselves in furs and settled in for the night. Night was the time of deep sleep. The fire glowed softly. The smoke hole showed a circle of stars or darkness. The earth walls radiated their stored warmth, and the people slept, held in the bowl of the earth, protected by the layers of soil and snow above, safe in the knowledge that the world outside could not reach them. This rhythm repeated day after day, week after week through the long winter. It was not monotonous, it was meditative, steady, restful. By midwinter the snow had erased the surface. On the plateau, in the river valleys and high basins, the snow fell steadily. It accumulated. 3 feet, 5 feet, 8 feet. The drifts grew deeper. The pines bent under the weight. The world became white and silent. The pit houses disappeared. The low mounds that marked their roofs were covered completely. The only sign of their existence was the smoke. Thin columns of smoke rose from the snow, marking the locations of the fires burning below. From a distance, the landscape looked empty. No structures, no movement, just snow and smoke. But beneath that snow, life continued. On the Missouri River, the earth lodges became gentle, snow-covered mounds. The passageways remained clear, tunneled through the drifts if necessary. The villages took on a muffled, quiet quality. The lodges, half buried, seemed to hunker down into the earth, waiting out the season. Both structures benefited from the snow. The snow on the roof was not a threat. It was insulation. 3 feet of snow has an R value comparable to several inches of modern fiberglass insulation. The snow acted as an additional blanket, piled on top of the already thick earthen roof. The deeper the snow, the warmer the interior. The snow created a buffer, a dead air space, between the interior warmth and the extreme cold of the outside air. Heat loss was minimized. The people inside understood this. They did not clear the snow from their roofs. They let it accumulate. They welcomed it. The smoke holes remained open. The smoke had to escape. But the small size of the opening and the steady column of hot air rising through it prevented cold air from sinking in. Snow might drift around the smoke hole, but it did not block it. The draft was too strong. The winter on both the plains and the plateau followed a pattern, though the timing and intensity varied by location and by year. Early winter, November-December, brought the first deep cold and the first significant snows. The world was transforming, but there was still variety. Some days were clear and bright, the sun reflecting off the snow in blinding brilliance. Other days were overcast, the sky a flat grey, the light diffuse and shadowless. Midwinter, January, early February, was the coldest, darkest time. The sun barely rose above the horizon. The days were short, the nights long. The temperature often stayed below 0 day and night. The wind was relentless. Blizzards were common. A blizzard on the plains or the plateau was not a gentle snowfall. It was a ground blizzard, wind picking up existing snow and driving it horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to 0. The air was filled with stinging, wind-driven snow crystals. The cold was intensified by wind chill. A person caught outside in a ground blizzard could freeze to death within an hour, even if they were only a few hundred yards from shelter. The people stayed inside during these blizzards. The wind howled above, the snow swirled, but inside the lodges and pit houses the sound was distant, muffled. The structures held. The warmth held. Late winter, late February-March, brought the first hints of change. The days lengthened noticeably. The sun, though still low, had more strength. On clear days, the temperature might rise above freezing for a few hours in the afternoon. But late winter was also unpredictable. Warm spells could be followed by sudden, brutal cold snaps. Snowstorms could still strike, sometimes the heaviest of the year. The people remained cautious. They did not venture far from the lodges. They continued to live on stored food. They waited for the clear, unmistakable signs that spring had truly arrived. The snow itself became part of the architecture of survival. On the plateau, where the pit houses were completely buried, the snow created a continuous insulating layer over the entire landscape. The pit houses were individual warm cells within this frozen world, connected only by the thin columns of smoke that marked their presence. On the plains, the earth lodges were partially buried, their domed roofs still visible as low mounds. The snow drifted around and over them, creating a landscape of gentle, rounded forms. In both cases, the snow transformed the structures. It added mass, which added thermal inertia. It added insulation, which reduced heat loss. It created a barrier against wind. The snow also created a kind of secondary shelter. The space between the earthen roof and the snow layer above was filled with still air that was warmer than the outside air but cooler than the interior air. This gradient helped moderate heat flow, slowing the loss of warmth from inside. The snow, in a sense, was the final outermost layer of the structure, a layer provided by nature, free of charge, perfectly suited to its purpose. For the people living inside the lodges and pit houses, deep winter had a particular quality. Time moved differently. The days were so short that it sometimes felt like the sun barely rose before it set again. The light from the smoke holes was brief and pale. Most of the life happened in the dim, warm glow of the fire. The sense of enclosure was profound. The world outside was not just cold, it was hostile, lethal. But inside there was safety, complete safety. The cold could not reach you. The wind could not touch you. This created a psychological state that was restful, almost meditative. There was nothing to fear, nothing to do but tend the fire, prepare food, work on handcrafts, tell stories, sleep. The people grew contemplative. The long hours of darkness encouraged introspection, reflection. Dreams, as mentioned earlier, were vivid and significant. People paid close attention to their inner lives, to their relationships, to the spiritual dimension of existence. But there was also a simplicity to deep winter. The complexity of summer life, the planting, the tending, the harvesting, the hunting, the travelling, was stripped away. There was only the lodge, the fire, the family, the stored food. Life was reduced to its essentials, and in that reduction there was a kind of clarity, a kind of peace.